All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. We're going to trace the dramatic, centuries-long evolution of law enforcement in the Indian subcontinent. It's a fascinating story that takes us all the way from ancient espionage and village liabilities right up to the uniformed constabularies we recognize today.
We'll be journeying chronologically through 6 distinct eras today: the philosophy of policing, spies and village watchmen, the Mughal mutual security, early English experiments, the Daraga dilemma, and finally, the modern police blueprint.
So, Section 1, the philosophy of policing. Why do we actually need the police?
Before we get into the wild history of how policing evolved, we really need to understand the fundamental philosophical difference between a soldier and a police officer and why civil society requires the latter to truly function. Our explainer today is based entirely on this incredibly detailed primary source. It's a 1929 monograph by B.R. Kalia detailing the history of the Punjab Police. It gives us this rare, highly detailed window into how the concept of law and order transformed over thousands of years in one of the most historically complex regions on Earth. The author makes a very compelling point early on. When a society emerges, martial law might exist temporarily, but civil administration will invariably outlast it.
And he brilliantly illustrates the core difference here. While the military fights foreign enemies for a country's glory, they're the proudest of a country's sons, the police are strictly a civil force. Their whole job is to watch criminals and enforce civil law. Soldiers aren't really supposed to enforce the behests of civil administration unless civil power becomes incredibly weak. The police are the everyday instruments that ensure we all conform to the rules, promoting tranquility and a mutually harmonious life.
Moving on to Section 2, spies and village watchmen, cloak, dagger, and community liability.
Let's jump way back to ancient India. And let me tell you, policing back then looked absolutely nothing like the uniformed officers on the streets today. It was an era totally defined by cloak and dagger tactics and extreme community liability. The crucial takeaway here is that early law enforcement relied heavily on joint responsibility. Basically, if a thief wasn't caught, the whole village paid the price. The local landholder and the villagers had to either track the offender beyond their village limits or literally pay out of pocket for the stolen goods. That is an incredibly heavy burden to place squarely on a community's shoulders.
To handle this massive responsibility, villages would hire watchmen to keep the peace. But here is the darkly comedic historical irony. They usually hired these watchmen from known predatory tribes. So the very people hired to protect the village were often thieves themselves. Our source even notes that to ensure greater protection, villages practically paid protection money to these plundering tribes just to induce them to prevent robberies by their own followers. Wild, right?
Now, to bypass all that local corruption and keep an eye on everything, rulers like the Mauryas set up these elaborate, state-sponsored spy networks. They hid behind completely ordinary or even holy disguises. These spies trained themselves in different languages in the art of disguise. They gathered intel while posing as ordinary householders, merchants, or even hermits and ascetics. They even used their own secret ciphers and signs to communicate with each other, creating this invisible web of state security.
All right, Section 3, the Mughal mutual security, the era of the coat wall.
As empires rose and fell, the approach to order shifted too. This brings us to the highly organized Mughal system. This period brought a much more structured, albeit intensely localized form of law enforcement. The Mughals introduced the Kotwal. This guy was a vigorous yet surprisingly humane officer who tracked citizens so closely he literally assigned jobs to the unemployed. Akbar had this institution running alongside his permanent standing army. The Kotwal was essentially the ultimate micromanager of peace. He kept a super strict register of houses, divided inhabitants into units, and got daily reports of exactly who left or entered. He engaged citizens in reciprocal assistance, effectively creating a massive, mandatory neighborhood watch program.
But there was a catch. This mutual security system just couldn't survive political chaos. It was perfectly suited for a simple, homogeneous agricultural community. But once the Mughal Empire started to fall and political control from the top relaxed, extortion and oppression spread unchecked through all levels of officials. The whole system completely collapsed.
Which leads us to Section 4, early English experiments, buying rights and imposing rules.
So when the British East India Company gained power, they really struggled to clean up the chaotic policing systems they had inherited. Our source actually calls the situation they found an Augean stable, a mythological reference to a profoundly filthy and chaotic mess that needed clearing out. In 1793, Lord Cornwallis tried to standardize things.
He stripped the local landholders of their police powers and created a strict hierarchy led by government-paid officers called darogas. But here's the crazy part. Each daroga was given a massive jurisdiction of about 400 square miles. They had watchmen under them, writers doing the bureaucratic paperwork, and jamadars commanding armed matchlock men to physically enforce the peace.
To incentivize these darogas, the government tried a very direct approach. They offered a specific reward of 10 rupees for every single dacoit or bandit that the daroga successfully caught and convicted. It was basically a bounty hunting style approach built right into the formal police structure.
And he didn't stop there. They were also entitled to a flat 10% commission on the value of any stolen property they recovered. This was a really early attempt to use financial incentives to drive police efficiency. On paper, to the administrators, it probably sounded like a brilliant idea. Pay for performance, right? But human nature, combined with those impossibly vast jurisdictions, would soon prove this system disastrously flawed.
That brings us to Section 5, the Daroga Dilemma, corruption and a gross mess. Yeah, those financial incentives completely backfired, leading to our next chapter of administrative disaster. By 1838, a committee presided over by Mr. Byrd investigated the state of police and found that the system was entirely broken. They famously described the village police setup as an absolute gross mess. There were no defined duties, rules, or obligations. The officers were incredibly corrupt, and the administration was universally dissatisfied with the results.
What's truly fascinating here is the root cause. It wasn't just a lack of rules. The British kept passing new regulations year after year, in 1807, 1810, 1817, trying to rearrange the rules and duties. But you can't legislate away the core problem. These officers had monumental responsibilities, spread over massive areas, and their pay was just terrible. You can't expect a system to stay honest under those conditions. It absolutely forced a breaking point.
And that breaking point leads us to Section 6, the modern police blueprint, importing the London model. This total failure forced a radical rethink, which eventually gave birth to the policing structure we recognize today. The English administrators realized they couldn't just keep patching up the broken systems. They needed something entirely new. Looking at how this timeline builds, starting in 1843, Sir Charles Napier imported a revolutionary new framework into Sind. Napier had the advantage of coming fresh from the reforms instituted by Sir Robert Peel in London. This new model worked so well it caught on fast. By 1853 it was in Bombay, by 1858 in Oudh, and it all culminated in the famous Indian Police Act of 1861, which laid the lasting foundation for the entire country. Napier utilized what was called the English model. The biggest change? It completely separated the police from the military and the judiciary entirely. They were now dedicated solely to crime prevention. Under this model, police officers literally had no other duties. Each district was placed under a superintendent who answered to the civil officer. But the police themselves were finally their own distinct professional and self-contained entity. Our source remarkably calls this final form an exotic institution, and that's because it wasn't a natural, local evolution. It didn't organically grow out of the soil of the ancient village watchmen or the Mughal cutwalls. It was a carefully engineered system, imported straight from London, designed specifically to replace all that prior chaos and anarchy with strict organizational discipline.
So it really makes you wonder, if the badges and uniforms of today are just the latest experiment in a very long historical timeline, how will society choose to enforce its laws tomorrow? I mean, we've gone from the joint responsibility of an entire village to hidden spies disguised as hermits, to bounty hunting darogas, and finally to a professionalized civil force. The evolution of policing is always a reflection of the society it serves. As our world continues to rapidly change, what do you think the next major leap for law enforcement will actually look like? Thank you for exploring this fascinating historical journey with me.